Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride.
It's a Wild Wild Wednesday.
We're back.
We're back. I like how last week we were like, we're going to cut down our episode, and it ended up being like 59 minutes or something.
Yeah, it was kind of like that.
It kind of do be like that sometimes. That. Yeah.
Well, the only thing that I'm ready to cut down is I'm ready to cut down that AC because it be getting hot already up in this West Texas lovely place that I live in.
Yeah, it's hot down here too. It's like hot. And it's only getting a bit hotter. You know what I mean?
I know. It is. We are still in April, friends, so I don't know. This might be one of those dog days of summer type of summers.
Well, yeah, for sure. Well, I don't think, Chelsea, that we really have anything else to talk about or to share before we kind of just roll on into it.
No, other than just my complaints of it possibly being a hot summer, and that's not at all related to this case. That's just me griping. So, no.
Yeah.
Nothing else. Nothing else is important.
Okay.
But you know what? I just thought of this. Speaking of griping can bring us into the case.
How so?
Well, because when somebody has a gut instinct on something and nobody else will really listen to them, that's kind of what they're viewed as. Like they're just griping about stuff, right?
Uh-huh.
And that's essentially what was happening at kind of the beginning of this case. We have somebody who is seeing dots that should be connected, and they're starting to like, hey, there's something going on. I know this doesn't seem like anybody, like, I know this doesn't seem like it's relevant, but nobody is listening to me. And I think a lot of the investigators just thought of this dude as just griping, right? He was just griping about how they were proceeding with the investigation, you know, and back then they didn't have technology, right? They didn't have the advancements. But what ended up happening is what we're going to talk about in this case, right? Two totally different women, 5 years apart, completely different lives, completely different environments, and a single person who believed that they were connected. No evidence, no confirmation, right? Just a gut instinct. And people just kind of thought he was griping about the process of the investigation.
Yeah. I gotta say that was a pretty smooth intro because I wasn't expecting that. And then you went into your intro and I was like, oh, here we are. We've arrived. So it's like that whole, the squeaky wheel gets, how does it go?
The squeaky wheel gets the oil.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that fits. So we're going to start off this case because there are two victims in this case. And we are going to go in kind of chronological order. And so we've got to rewind it back to the mid-'80s. And in November of 1986, a woman by the name of Margarette Eby was living a life she had spent decades building. She was a professor at the University of Michigan, Flint, and she was a high-ranking academic serving as provost and vice chancellor for academic affairs. And it was a position that put her at the center of leadership and visibility on campus. She had come to Flint in 1981 after an already established career, bringing with her a reputation for being sharp, driven, and deeply committed to the work she was doing. She was also really talented in another way. She was a musician, an active supporter of the arts, and someone who really embedded herself into the cultural and social fabric of the city. So she wasn't just like a Flint citizen, she was really in the inner workings of it. The thing with Margaret, very passionate, very ambitious, there are other reports that point to the fact that she wasn't a quiet figure. People described her as being very energetic, engaging, and social, but also pretty intense. And I think, to be fair, to be that successful in so many different areas, you kind of do have to be an intense person. And she had really high standards. She expected things done quickly. She expected things done correctly. And she didn't hesitate to really push people. And all of this is important to say, right? Because it plays into later theories around criminology and victimology and that kind of stuff. So there were a lot of people that really, really admired Margarette Eby. And then there were some people who just did not. So she could be charming and warm in one setting, and depending on who you would ask, demanding, possibly even abrasive in another. The kind of person who absolutely made it an impression one way or another. But outside of her work, arguably, Margaret's life was pretty full. She hosted gatherings at her home. She would bring students together, academics, artists, community figures. She was constantly organizing events, entertaining often, and moved within the social circles that extended beyond the university. By the mid-1980s, even after stepping down from her provost role following internal conflict and complaints, she remained active and connected and visible. She had leased a residence in the gatehouse on the grounds of the Charles Stewart Mott estate, and this is an important piece to note. This was a very private, secluded property that was tied to one of the most prominent families in the area. It was quiet and controlled and removed from other environments where, people would typically associate violent crime, where it was a place of safety. Which is exactly why what ended up happening startled and bothered so many people. Margarette Eby was last seen alive on November 7th, 1986. From what has been reported, the concern really started building when she missed plans and people could not get in touch with her. That is one of those details that maybe starts off feeling not as important, but it is important because this was not someone who simply disappeared from her routine without people noticing. And just 2 days later, on November 9th, concern began to grow when she wasn't responding to anybody. When people arrived at the home and found the door unlocked, something was off. Her purse and keys were visible inside, untouched. Calls into the house went unanswered, and eventually they made the decision to go upstairs. And that is where they found Margaret. Margaret was found in her bedroom, and the scene was immediately described as violent, far beyond what anybody would have expected. Margaret had been viciously raped, she had been brutally attacked, and she had been stabbed repeatedly. The level of violence was shocking, mostly because it was so excessive and it felt really, really personal. And so almost immediately, it started to bring a lot of attention. This case started to bring a lot of attention because of who Margaret was and the violence of the act. Now, something important to note is there was no clear signs of forced entry. There were no immediate suspects, no obvious explanation for how someone would have gotten close enough into that space without being noticed. Because again, this was a very, for lack of better words, fancy private area. Investigators processed the scene and found what should have been critical evidence. There was semen recovered from the assault, and on the bathroom faucet, there was a bloody fingerprint left by the killer. Evidence like that would likely be solved quickly today, but in 1986, it just wasn't enough. DNA testing was still in its early stages and not widely used in criminal investigations. So it was really frustrating. There was evidence there, but the ability to turn it into a name just wasn't. And so unfortunately, after so much manpower and so much time investigating Margarette Eby's violent attack and murder, the case eventually stalled.
So we learned about Margaret. And like we said in the beginning, we are dealing with two women, two separate lives. And the second woman that we're going to talk about is Nancy Ludwig. Nancy Ludwig's life looked very different from Margarette Eby's. But 5 years later, she would be found in a scene that carried really unsettling similarities. Nancy was a flight attendant, someone whose life revolved around movement and airports and hotels and constant travel, right? Her routine wasn't tied to one place, but it still had structure. She knew where she was supposed to be and when she was supposed to be there and how to navigate unfamiliar environments. Being alone in strange places wasn't unusual for her. It was essentially a part of her job.
Yeah, and just kind of as a side note, Nancy had been with Northwest Airlines as a flight attendant for years. So, hotel stops, airport shuttles, and overnight stays was a part of her normal routine. She wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. She wasn't doing anything unusual. She was not somewhere reckless or doing anything reckless. She was literally in a place connected to her work, following the kind of routine she had probably done many times before, just as an important side note.
Yeah. In 1991, Nancy was staying at the Hilton Hotel in Romulus, Michigan, near Detroit Metropolitan Airport. It was a routine stop, the kind of place that she likely stayed countless times before. Nothing about it stood out. Nothing about the night suggested anything out of the ordinary. But at some point during her stay, something went wrong. Nancy was attacked inside her hotel room. It was inside of her hotel room that she was raped and she was murdered. And just like in Margarette Eby's case, the violence didn't feel random. It was not rushed. It was not chaotic in the way people often imagine.
Yeah, I mean, from a psychological standpoint, this is a key piece, right? Because it wasn't quick or accidental. Reports describe Nancy's throat wound as being so severe that it nearly decapitated her. And that really, I don't say that to be graphic, but simply to show how violent it was. So the attack was not just about getting in and getting out. It was ferocious. It was, like Chelsea said, controlled, and it really carried the kind of overkill that investigators often look at very differently.
It really seemed personal,
Yeah.
or at least kind of close proximity and controlled. There wasn't anything that would suggest that this was just a random act, somebody who came by randomly or came by on the whim. This was someone who had time and they were willing to use it. Again, there was evidence, biological evidence was recovered from the scene, the kind that years later would become critical. But at the time, just like in 1986, it wasn't enough to identify a suspect. The technology just wasn't there yet. So now there were two cases, two women, two completely different lives. Margarette Eby, a high-ranking academic living on a private estate tied to wealth and status, and then Nancy Ludwig, a flight attendant moving through hotels and cities as part of her everyday life. Different environments, different circumstances, different worlds entirely. And because of that, the cases were treated exactly how you would expect, separate. Nothing on the surface suggested they should be connected. Again, they were different locations, different timelines, different victims altogether. There was no obvious reason to link them. But there was something about the cases that didn't sit right with at least one person. Because while investigators saw two unrelated crimes, someone else saw a pattern beginning to take shape.
And this brings us back to what Chelsea was talking about in the beginning, right? And that's what makes this case, or these two cases, really different. And it pushes out of the category of two really tragic unrelated crimes into, hey, somebody actually saw a connection in this really, really early on. And it was not a detective or a task force or even like a forensic analyst. It was a family member. It was Margarette Eby's son, Marc Eby. And Marc becomes really important in this case because he did not have a vague feeling and kept it to himself. And it becomes pretty incredible regarding his intuition. After Nancy Ludwig was murdered, Marc heard about the details of her case, and something about it immediately felt familiar. The horrific violence, the way that the attack was described, and the overall nature of the crime reminded him of what happened to his mother years earlier. And this is what's kind of, I mean, so impressive, but kind of crazy. Marc Eby, Margaret's son, eventually reached out to Nancy's husband, Art Ludwig. And I mean, if we can just think, what that entailed of these two men from two different families connected by the worst kind of loss possible, comparing details from cases that law enforcement had not officially connected yet. And so Marc, at that point, believed in his gut, in his bones, that the same person may have been responsible for the murder of his mother as well. And after he and Art talked through the similarities, that concern was brought to investigators. But at the time, there was still not enough physical proof to officially link the two cases. Yes, they had similarities, they had family members raising concerns, but they did not really have the forensic confirmation that they needed to have. And even after this, nothing really happened, even though he was pretty adamant and spoke up and made his voice heard. Because at that time, we have to understand that these officers are looking at it from a non-emotional perspective, in theory. And there just wasn't enough on paper for them to make that leap, to justify that leap. Law enforcement has a tendency to work off of patterns, yes, but patterns that can be proven not just based off of emotions. And without a second suspect, without forensic confirmation, without something more concrete to tie these two crime scenes together, the idea really just kind of stagnated. It stayed exactly where it started, as just a theory from a grieving son. And, frustrating, right? Especially with those of us who understand that, we believe possibly that people have, sixth senses when it comes to stuff like this. And I think in hindsight, this is where this case gets really frustrating, because this is where timing matters and technology matters, because what he was pointing to wasn't wrong. It was just a little too early in the process for the technology to really catch up and corroborate what he was saying. Even though evidence existed, the system didn't have a way to connect it. So the cases stayed separate, filed in different places, investigations moving in different directions, which led ultimately to years and years passing with no real movement in either Margarette Eby or Nancy Ludwig's case. And Nancy's case did not sit still during those years. Investigators followed a huge number of leads, and some of them seemed really promising at first. One man who came under attention was a man by the name of Michael Flynn. He had presented himself as a Northwest pilot, which obviously stood out because Nancy was a Northwest flight attendant. But according to later summaries of the case, he was not actually a pilot. He was a firefighter on disability. And his story had enough strange pieces to make investigators kind of look a little bit more closely at him. But that was just another piece to the frustration about the investigation, is a person can look suspicious, like Michael Flynn, their story can feel off, they can even seem to fit parts of the case, But once DNA testing advanced, they put their suspicions to the test, quite literally, and Michael Flynn was not a match. He was totally ruled out. So he became another example of how many roads investigators went down before the evidence finally started to point to the right guy. And in that gap of time, the space between what people suspected and what could actually be proven, the person responsible stayed exactly where they had always been, unknown, but not totally gone.
For years, both cases sat where they had been. 2 separate investigations, 2 separate victims, and no clear path forward. Not until the early 2000s. And that's when things started to change. In the early 2000s, we had an advancement in DNA technology, and it was quietly transforming a lot of the current criminal cases, but it was also breathing fresh life into a lot of these cold cases. Evidence that had once been collected and stored, evidence that really could not be analyzed at the time, was now being revisited. And those samples were being retested. And the examinations were done with, again, tools that we didn't have in the 80s or before, or really even into the early 90s. And that is when Margarette Eby's case comes back into focus. In 2001, investigators reopened the case, and this time they used updated DNA testing methods. The biological evidence collected from the original crime scene was finally able to be processed in a way that would generate a usable profile. That profile was entered into a system designed to do something that hadn't been possible before, which was to compare it against other known samples. And that's when the first real connection was made. The DNA from Margarette Eby's case didn't just produce a profile, it matched evidence from another crime. And if you were guessing Nancy Ludwig, you would be correct. Suddenly, what had once been a theory, something one person had noticed and no one could prove, was now tangible. It was now real. The same individual had been responsible for both crimes. 2 women, 5 years apart, and again, completely different lives, but they were connected by this one person. And just like that, the entire case shifted. Because now this wasn't just about solving one murder. This was about finding someone who had already done it twice and had gone undetected for years. But even then, they still didn't have a name. They had the DNA, they had the connection, they even had that the confirmation that this wasn't random, but the person behind it, well, that was still unknown. And that's where the investigation had to change again, because now the question wasn't who did this. It was, how do you find someone who has already disappeared into the background?
So at this point, now that investigators knew that the same person was in fact responsible for both Margarette Eby and Nancy Ludwig's murder, the case shifted from uncertainty and feeling to something more focused and for sure. They weren't necessarily looking for patterns to connect the 2 cases. They had one. And so the question now is how to put a name to it. Because having DNA in both or either cases is one thing, but connecting that DNA to an actual person is another. And that's where older evidence started to matter again in these 2 cases. So let's rewind in our minds back to 1986. So back in 1986, when Margarette Eby was killed, investigators had recovered more than just biological evidence. They also, remember, found that bloody fingerprint left behind on a bathroom faucet. And at the time, it hadn't led anywhere. There was no match, no suspect, nothing to tie this bloody fingerprint to. It became really just another piece of evidence sitting in a file that had gone cold. But now, with the DNA connection linking the two murders, that fingerprint really started to take on new importance. And so investigators began looking more closely at who had access to the Mott estate back in 1986 when Margaret Eby was murdered. It was one question that never quite went away and was now more critical than ever. There was always belief that this wasn't a random intruder, that it was someone who had been able to gain access into the property, move through it like they knew it, and eventually into Margaret Eby's home without raising any sort of alarms in a very secured, tightly knit upper class property. And so that started to narrow things down, because the question, who could move kind of undetected but had access, turned investigators' attention to maintenance workers, contractors, people who had legitimate reasons to be there, but who also probably wouldn't stand out. And what they noticed, they always say hindsight 2020. And so sometimes we miss things in the initial investigation, and that's where, cold case investigators come through and start from the beginning. And so after going through all of the maintenance workers and contractors there at the Mott estate, one of the connections led back to Buckler Automatic Lawn Sprinkler Company. And that was a business responsible for servicing the sprinkler system on the estate. Of course, it was a routine job, something that required access to the grounds, familiarity with the property, and the ability for their employees to move through it without drawing a bunch of attention. And among the people tied to that company was a man by the name of Jeffrey Gorton. At that point, Gorton wasn't just a name, he was someone who had been on the property, someone who had proximity, someone who, for the first time in this entire investigation, fit into the space where the crime had actually occurred. And when investigators took a closer look, more and more started to align, because once they had his name, they had something else they did not have before, a way to test against the evidence collected.
Once investigators had Jeffrey Gorton in their sights, the case moved quickly in a way it hadn't in years. For the first time, they weren't working in the abstract. They had a person who fit the environment, the access, and the timeline. This thing had shifted from a theory to something, again, tangible, a lead, a real live lead. But suspicion wasn't enough. After all the years this case had gone unresolved, and they needed something definite. That's where the evidence finally did what it had been waiting to do. Gorton's DNA had been obtained and tested against the biological evidence collected from both crime scenes. The results came back as a match. Not partial, not inconclusive, a full confirmation that the same individual connected to that DNA had been present in both Margaret Eby's home in 1986 and Nancy Ludwig's hotel room in 1991. And then, let's not forget, there was the fingerprint. The bloody print that had been left behind on the bathroom faucet in Eby's home, the one piece of physical evidence that had sat dormant for years, was compared to Gorton's as well. And again, it matched. And just like that, everything that had once been uncertain was no longer sitting in the classification of uncertain. The connection that had once been dismissed as a theory was now a fact. The evidence that had once been incomplete was now undeniable. Two cases that had lived separately for years were now permanently linked to one person, Jeffrey Gorton, a man who hadn't been a stranger to that property, a man who had been there before, a man who for years had existed quietly in the background while the case remained unsolved. And that's what makes this moment hit the way it does, because nothing about him had changed. He hadn't suddenly appeared. He hadn't made a mistake that brought attention to him. The only thing that changed was essentially the advancement in our technology.
By the time Jeffrey Gorton was finally identified in 2002, more than 10 years had passed since Nancy Ludwig's murder, and an even longer time had passed since Margarette Eby's murder. It wasn't a tip or a sudden breakthrough that led to his arrest. It was the evidence finally catching up. Once investigators matched the DNA from both crime scenes and tied it to Gorton, along with the fingerprint left behind in Eby's home, the case that had sat unresolved for years suddenly became clear. He was arrested, taken into custody, and for the first time, there was a direct answer to something that had lingered for many families and investigators for over a decade. The trial that followed focused heavily on the evidence collected. There wasn't a complicated narrative or a mystery left to unravel. It really just boiled down to the data and the science and the DNA. In 2002, Gorton was convicted of the rape and murder of Nancy Ludwig, and rather than contest to the second case of Margarette Eby, he later entered a no contest plea. The court sentenced him to life in prison, closing both cases with a level of certainty that had not existed before. Unfortunately, the closure, as we say in almost every case, really doesn't erase what came before it, because for years, the evidence had been there sitting. It just wasn't able to be used. The connection had been suggested, as in Margarette Eby's son, kind of since the murder of Nancy, but it just couldn't be proven at the time. So while the system waited for the technology to catch up, the person responsible stayed in the background, living a super ordinary life, going completely unnoticed. And I think that is what's really hard about this case, right? Is you had all of it there, all the things there to convict and connect the perpetrator to it. But it just wasn't able to be used. And the craziest part, and I think that this is really wild to me, is in Nancy's case, homeboy Gorton there was like no real tie to him to the hotel. Like, he wasn't an employee there. He wasn't working there. I think he was just looking for an opportunity and found what he considered to be a vulnerable victim at the time. And he broke into her room and killed her. It's pretty awful.
You know, Bailey, I don't know. I think what bothers me with this case is the Nancy piece of this does not fit for me. And I'm not saying that he didn't do both. Like, obviously he was connected to both. But with Margaret, he was there on the grounds, right? Like, he had access to her, he had access to the house. I'm sure he saw her as just a vulnerable, because she was around 55 or so when she had been attacked and murdered. But I'm not understanding, like, why Nancy? Do you know anything about that?
I don't. Because I understand what you're saying. Like, in Margarette Eby's case, it's more logical. I mean, what he did is not logical, but what I'm saying is he was employed by the sprinkler system there. He had access to her. That's how he saw her and gained access to her. But with Nancy, it's totally different. She was a flight attendant staying at a hotel near the Detroit Metropolitan Airport. And all I know, at least from the book, so I read through the book that this case is based off of, or a book that is based off of this case, I should say. And it's called Blood Justice by Tom Henderson. And there's so many details in there that obviously we didn't include in this case because it would be so long, but it was a really great book and they have an Audible version of it. But basically, there's no clear data that shows that there's a connection to how he kind of stumbled across Nancy. Like he wasn't a maintenance worker at the hotel or anything like that.
Right.
That he knew her personally or targeted her specifically ahead of time. From what I gather from the articles and everything, the prevailing understanding is that this was likely just an opportunistic encounter. He came across her in a setting where she was, probably a little isolated and vulnerable because, I mean, she was a flight attendant, so she traveled alone, and a lot of times when they leave the airports, they go to by themselves to the hotels and that kind of thing, and acted on that opportunity.
Right. I just, oh, man. Obviously, you and I have been talking about cases that are like this, and you would think, and maybe listeners, maybe you feel the same way, you would think that after a while, you would have a sense of like, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I get that. And I have to say, after all of these cases, I never leave with a sense of like, well, that makes sense. Yeah. That's understandable. You know what I mean? Like these types of crimes, I just cannot fathom them. They don't make sense to me. I just don't, I can't wrap my brain around the fact that somebody looks at another human being and they're like, yeah, tonight feels like a good time to rape and murder and torture a woman. Yeah, I'll have a taco, have a drink, and then rape and murder someone.
Yeah. Well, I mean, luckily our brains don't work that way, right? Because it was Nancy checked into the hotel around 9 p.m. and was last seen heading to her room alone. And then later she was found murdered in her room. There was no confirmed forced entry. And so what investigators believe, but haven't really been able to prove, is that he was waiting in the hallway or stairwell and may have like forced her into the room as she unlocked the door. Maybe, he knocked and she opened it thinking it might have been room service or something like that. And yeah, I'm with you. It's one of those things that just nobody expects, right? Nobody expects that's how it's going to happen. And I don't know. I just don't know what goes on in people's brains to need to do that to somebody. Like, that's what I have a hard time understanding is like what went so wrong for you to, like you said, for you to be able to be like, you know what? Instead of, going to the gym or learning jujitsu or like painting my numbers, I'm going to do these horrific things in my spare time for dopamine, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I had another thought when we were talking about Margaret's son when he had heard about the case, right, with Nancy Ludwig's case. And it really makes me wonder if police, if investigators, if detectives ever do reach out to family members of cases that are similar to ask them questions. You know what I mean? Like, or if that's something that, like with Margaret's son, if it's something that maybe a victim's family member would then go to the police and say, hey, I know that this doesn't seem like it is likely connected, but I have a bad feeling about this. This seems very similar to what we experienced, like with my mom or with a family member of ours. And it really does. It makes you wonder if that's something that police should look into more, right? Is asking people in the community, like, does this seem familiar to you guys? Because after a while, cases have got to start running together for these detectives and investigators, especially the ones that are well seasoned and have been doing this for a long time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's one of those things that it makes sense when we're talking about it, but as an investigator, it doesn't make sense to go off of like emotions like that. You get what I mean?
I do. Um, Speaking of which, have you seen there's a new movie out on Netflix called Crime 101?
No, uh-uh.
It has Chris Hemsworth
Huh?
and Mark Ruffalo. But yeah, this movie makes me think about this case a little bit because the detective in it was pretty much like, I have got a feeling on this. I know that this thing is happening. And everybody else in the department was like, dude, you can't just be saying stuff off of your feelings. Like, there's no proof. There's no evidence. And it does. Again, it makes you wonder, like, do you have those detectives that have that little bit of a sixth sense? Do you have people that work on the force that have a little bit of a sixth sense in a department, in a environment where you can't really base things off of feelings, right? And I agree with that. How scary would that be if everything was just off of feelings and not on hard evidence?
Well, sure.
But how much do we miss by not listening to intuition? I don't know. It's a question.
Yeah. Well, that's our case, you guys. We made it a little bit shorter on purpose. Please give us feedback. If you like our 30 to 40-minute cases that you can listen to kind of in one way going to work instead of, hour and 15-minute cases, let us know on our Instagram. Send us an email at wildsidepodcast@gmail.com. We'd appreciate it. And as always, thanks for hanging out with us through this wild and crazy ride.
And we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators.